Good evening and welcome everyone. Bienvenidos. Rosa Cabrera, Director of the UIC Rafael Cintrón Ortiz Latino Cultural Center, better known as the LCC. Thank you for joining us in this virtual space for climates of inequality. And as Jorge mentioned, this is the last of 3 presentations hosted this season, highlighting local and national leaders working on environmental and climate justice. The guest speakers have been sharing frameworks and solutions to address the disproportionate impacts of climate change and environmental harms inflicted on historically and currently excluded Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities, as well as undocumented, disabled, queer and trans people. Climates of Inequality is a project of the Humanities Action Lab, which also involves a traveling exhibition telling the stories of 22 communities in the US, Puerto Rico, Colombia, and Mexico. They have been burdened by environmental injustices for decades now. The Chicago story is of Little Village, one of the 6 sacrifice zones in the city, and developed by the LCC with community partners Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization. Last year, the Chicago story was expanded to feature other sacrifice zones and to travel to some of these areas around Chicago. The presentation today will focus on how climate-related events such as wildfires amplify existing inequalities and how to reduce the resulting harms, in particular for the most stigmatized population, such as undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. Before I introduce our guest speaker, a few shout-outs of appreciation are in order to our partners, Alianza Americas and Little Village Environmental Justice Organization, for their ongoing collaboration over the past 5 years, and to the Humanities Action Lab for sustaining this program. To our co-sponsors, the Department of Latin American and Latino Studies, Freshwater Lab, Great Cities Institute, Las Ganas Project, Museums and Exhibition Studies, Social Justice Initiative, and Sustainability at UIC. Also to the students panelists in my environmental justice class, who will facilitate a short conversation with our guest speaker after the presentation. They are Alicia Ribeiro, Gina Shotawatan, Julia Kaufman, Melissa Spindola, and Vanessa Lopez. Our speaker, who we are very excited to have with us today, is Dr. Michael Méndez, Assistant Professor of Environmental Policy and Planning at the University of California, Irvine, and visiting scientist at the National Center for Atmospheric Research. He previously was the Pinchot Faculty Fellow at the Yale School of Environment. His first book, called Climate Change from the Streets, was published in 2020, and he was the winner of the Harold and Margaret Sprout Award, sponsored by the International Studies Association and the Association of Humanist Sociologists, Betty and Alfred McClung Lee Award. In 2022, Professor Méndez was awarded the Carnegie Fellowship. So now please join me in welcoming Professor Méndez.
Thank you, Rosa, and thank you to the Climate of Inequalities the colloquium this fall. It's really a pleasure to be here among so many people that care deeply about the Latino community and environmental issues as well. And I think we're at a pivotal moment right now in terms of where the environmental justice, health equity, and climate change or climate action will be in Latino communities. In 2020, I actually got a memory on my phone about a quote I did for the Politico newspaper, asking me about the lackluster support of climate change through the 2020 presidential elections there. And my quote was, when you make climate change real, when you put it in that economic and public health frame, that's when climate change becomes a priority for a lot of Latino communities. And in the 2022 midterms, as well as this election, we see that Latino communities are experiencing multiple inequalities of multiple priorities, including around economic and health issues. And making climate change again real is quite important. Linking it to other types of inequalities is important for these communities throughout the United States. If you're talking about urban communities and agricultural communities, which I'll be talking about shortly. So let me just share my screen and then we'll get started here. Okay, great. Thank you. Again, this research here will be focusing on the populations that are often rendered invisible during disasters. Of course, these communities have been living in these areas for years, if not decades, but they're rendered invisible in the context of public policy and disaster policy. My research agenda asks how climate-induced disasters such as heat waves, drought, and wildfires exacerbate existing disparities for undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants. In this approach, I explore the methods disasters influence migration patterns and interactions between people and place that limit life opportunities, facilitate movements, and impact public health. Globally, climate change is disrupting livelihoods and exacerbating socioeconomic vulnerabilities, leaving even more people with no choice but to move. Migration from Mexico, for example, is influenced by multiple factors: growing economic inequality, violence, drug conflicts, and trade wars. The situation is now compounded by environmental decline and changing climatic events, particularly in agricultural and indigenous regions of central and southern Mexico. However, when Latino and Indigenous Mexican people migrate to places like California for better life opportunities, they do not leave behind the disproportionate impact that climate change will have on their bodies and their families. It often follows them here to the United States. For example, in recent fires, the economic impact of smoke taint is estimated to have cost the California wine industry $3.7 billion in recent fires. Smoke taint occurs when smoke and ash permeate the skin of grapes, which can affect the taste and smell of wine. However, too much concern is often placed on the impacts of the wine industry, but not on the farm workers that are harvesting grapes during wildfire events and how their lungs are also being tainted. They are not provided with adequate occupational health and safety protections, let alone hazard pay or federal disaster funds to work in mandatory evacuation zones that are often considered hazardous to the general population. Making these inequities visible is important because in places like California, we are experiencing a major climate change crisis. In the last several years, millions of people have been impacted by multiple disasters, fires, blackouts, heat waves, drought, hazardous air quality, flooding, and of course, the ever-present COVID-19 pandemic. These compounding of disasters have cascading health, social, and economic impacts. And due to existing structural inequality, these impacts are disproportionately affecting low-income people of color. In essence, wildfires in California are not isolated disasters. They now compound with other hazards and comorbidities, or what is called a syndemic in the field of public health. So now more than ever, it's crucial to understand how these events amplify existing inequalities and how to lessen the resulting harms, particularly in the context of extreme wildfire impacts to undocumented Latinos and Indigenous migrants. While this research is based on impacts to California's most marginalized and stigmatized populations, it also has global implications. For example, California's wildfire problems are now affecting sensitive populations around the world. For example, in 2020, smoke from multiple wildfire events reached not only New York State, but also Western Europe. Given their social status, undocumented Latino and Indigenous migrants are particularly vulnerable to disasters such as wildfires and require special consideration in disaster planning. They are disproportionately affected by racial discrimination, exploitation, economic hardships, less English and Spanish proficiency, and fear deportation in their everyday lives, which I often call their pre-disaster marginalized status. And when a disaster compounds with those existing inequalities, they experience a higher form of marginalization. Particularly because they are not part of our society's social safety net, not included in federal disaster aid, let alone unemployment insurance, in many cases, healthcare, and other types of social benefits. Our research on wildfires in California's Ventura, Santa Barbara, and Sonoma counties was developed in a co-productionist framework. I know Rosa mentioned that you were studying about Indigenous knowledge. This is part of that co-productionist framework, including other types of knowledges. Migrant rights and environmental justice groups that lived and worked during the wildfire disasters and other disasters were my co-authors on several publications. And they were vital contributors to the research design, data collection, and analysis. They were also key in presenting study findings to multiple policy audiences at the local, state, and international levels, including the United Nations International Organization for Migration and also the United Nations Habitat Agency as well, and really helping to put a human face, a human-centered approach to some of these disasters. Moreover, this co-productionist framework shows that undocumented migrants are rendered invisible in the context of public policy by systemic racism and cultural norms regarding U.S. citizenship and who is considered a worthy disaster victim. Our research highlights further that how political choices are intentionally being made that prioritize some lives over others. Climate change is making wildfire season longer and more severe. Moreover, 17 of the 20 largest wildfires by acreage in California have occurred since 2020. And Sonoma County, one of my research sites, is also an epicenter for wildfires and the bastion for California's high-end wine industry, and has suffered from multiple years of extreme wildfire events that have been ranked in the top 5 and top 20 for the most destructive and deadly wildfires in California's history. Cumulatively, they have burned nearly 1 million acres, destroyed over 12,000 structures, and caused 34 deaths. While climate scientists expect wildfires to become more frequent and severe, it is important to explore how some people and communities are more affected by these events than others. While many of California's fire-prone regions are largely populated by higher income groups, they also include hundreds of thousands of low-income individuals who lack the resources to prepare or recover from fire. These numbers likely will surge according to the California Fourth Climate Assessment Report, which projects that the state's wildfire burn area may increase by 77% by the end of the century. The state of California, however, does not have a comprehensive analysis of wildfire as it relates to social vulnerability or demographic data. Outcomes occurring during and after wildfires have major environmental justice implications, in that certain populations, due to their socioeconomic status, must live with the disproportionate share of environmental impacts and suffer the related public health and quality of life burdens. Moreover, in our research, we investigate how human identities such as gender, class, race, indigeneity, and immigration status intersect with wildfires and other disasters. Now, for a little bit more context on one of my research sites, Sonoma, again, this is in Northern California, next to Napa County, again, one of the bastions of California's high wind, award-winning wine. Sonoma has been the epicenter for extreme wildfires and environmental injustice in the state. Media outlets, governments, and scholars across the country, however, have largely focused reports on the loss of coastal and hillside mansions and its impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers. The Sonoma fires, however, not only destroyed expensive property and crops, but also endangered the health and livelihood of thousands of undocumented migrants. In this case study, I highlight the forms of discrimination and unsafe labor conditions faced by undocumented Latino and indigenous migrants during wildfires. As one resident of the region told me, undocumented migrants are the invisible population living and working behind the Bougainvillea curtain. They are struggling to survive in a region of wealth and prosperity. This idiom references the fast-growing evergreen vine with an explosive magenta color that adorns the gates of mansions and farms for added privacy. California is home to an estimated 2.6 million undocumented migrants, many of whom are farm workers or unemployed, who are employed in service jobs such as housekeeping and landscaping. In Sonoma County, undocumented individuals are estimated to account for 8% of the population, or 38,000 people. And we anticipate that this is a much lower estimate. I mean, this is on the low end, and there's more undocumented individuals in this area. Governments in California in particular overlook the needs of Indigenous farm workers and migrant families in developing disaster plans. Sonoma is home to a growing Indigenous Mexican population. It is estimated that over 12,000 Indigenous people from Mexico and Central America live and work in Sonoma County. And again, that 12,000 estimate is quite low. We think it's much higher. And many of these Indigenous migrants are concentrated in labor-intensive sectors such as row crops and wine grapes. Indigenous migrants perform an increasing amount of the arduous labor, which contributes to the profitability and affordability of fresh fruits, vegetables, and of course, wine. In particular, Indigenous people in Sonoma County are often culturally and linguistically isolated. Many are illiterate and some speak neither Spanish nor English, but only their native Indigenous languages such as Mixteco, Triqui, Maya, and Chatino. It is important to note that Indigenous Mexican people are not Hispanic or Latino, but they are Indigenous. They are often homogenized generally with Latino or Hispanic communities. While disaster relief efforts in Sonoma fires have largely been praised as effective, migrant workers were especially impacted by the fire due to the loss of employment, violations of occupational health and safety standards, the lack of evacuation information in their native languages, confusion about eligibility for disaster relief services, lack of unemployment and healthcare insurance, and poor infrastructure and housing in migrant communities. Undocumented migrants' socioeconomic situation is usually precarious. However, the wildfire disaster intensified their already difficult situation. And again, creating this, what I mentioned earlier, this form of hyper-marginalization. The Sonoma fires, moreover, revealed how undocumented migrants and those with seasonal work visas require special consideration in disaster planning. These individuals are often afraid to seek help and restitution during and after a wildfire for fear of deportation. Undocumented migrants are also unable to access disaster relief services because of language barriers and an explicit prohibition from accessing federal disaster assistance funds. The lack of occupational health and safety standards is of key concern as intensifying wildfires collide with harvest season each year. Undocumented farm workers are shouldering the burden of protecting Sonoma's wine grapes from smoke and ash. Fine particulate matter, or PM 2.5 from wildfire smoke, is this toxic mix of heavy metals and other chemicals from burning structures and objects, and it can be several times more harmful to human respiratory health than PM 2.5 from other sources such as car exhaust. And just to kind of get this in your head, agricultural work, farm work takes a lot of labor, a lot of stress on the body because you're running back and forth. And as you're running back and forth, you're breathing in more air. So you're taking in higher concentrations of that particulate matter from wildfire smoke, again, which is this toxic mix of fertilizers, pesticides, burning structures, cars, and you name it. And again, it's more harmful to human respiratory health than the air you breathe from a car exhaust. Since 2015 in Northern California, the annual mean PM 2.5 has increased because of extreme wildfire events, and these events have overtaken as the main source of PM 2.5 exceedances. The harm that wildfire smoke causes to farm workers may be greater than previously thought, bolstering the argument for additional research on and policies to help safeguard one of the most vulnerable and stigmatized populations. Just to give you a little bit idea of what is going on in terms of these disasters and undocumented farm workers and migrants, I have two quotes here. The first reads, "We all got sick. Our throats closed in from breathing too much smoke, and our kids couldn't go to school. We had to buy masks and medicine for our throats, and some goggles because my eyes were irritated when I work, end quote. And that was from an Indigenous farm worker. Other farmers would talk about working in this toxic, smoky conditions for days, if not weeks. Some of these wildfires last 3 months, and they would come home and literally have black saliva. Another migrant landscaper told us, quote, I could not get to the homes where I worked because the streets were closed. Two of the homes I worked at were destroyed. One of my good friends was lost during the disaster. We had only been living in the area for 3 weeks before he died. I myself am a cancer survivor and I'm the only one that provides for the family, end quote. So this quote in particular really looks at the multiple existing health disparities and other socioeconomic disparities that farm workers, migrant, undocumented in particular, have before disaster, and how these inequalities and comorbidities are working synergetically to create, again, this idea of a syndemic that's happening, what the field of public health calls a syndemic. So to wrap up in the next couple of slides, I really want to leave you with this idea of thinking beyond just property values. As I mentioned before, people often think of wildfires and impacts to wealthy homeowners and farmers. But we really need to think beyond these property values because current disaster policies render many minority and poor communities invisible. As shown in this case study, really briefly, migrant communities were among the most impacted during wildfires. Moreover, immigration status has received little attention in disaster vulnerability mapping research. Though a large proportion of disaster studies have considered race and ethnicity as vulnerability factors, impacts experienced by migrants required intersectional research approach. Current disaster policies also fail to account for the complex web of impacts caused by disasters far beyond the destruction of property within the perimeter of the fire itself. For example, toxic smoke flows down from burning mountainsides, settling in densely populated valleys below, threatening outdoor workers. Lavish hillside mansions are destroyed or evacuated, leaving low-wage migrant gardeners, housekeepers, and caregivers unemployed. Tourism throughout the region shuts down, putting thousands of hotel employees out of work. From the loss of housing and infrastructure to the closure of schools and job sites, multiple regions are impacted beyond the footprint of the actual fire. For example, a low-income family living outside of a burn area who loses several weeks of wages without eligibility for assistance may be more negatively impacted than a higher income homeowner who lives in the fire risk zone, whose property is replaced by their homeowner's insurance policy, which also pays for their accommodation for them to stay in the interim. And thinking beyond property values, again, I want you to take a look at this photo here of these little girls wearing N95 respirator masks. I think since the COVID-19 pandemic, we have become all desensitized to images like this. But if you look at the date here, 2017, it shows how many years, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, that these populations were living with the inequitable impacts of environmental disasters such as wildfires and climate-induced disasters. So one of the other policy implications I want to leave you is that if you really want to tackle disaster risk reduction, it starts with the social integration of migrants before disaster, and integrating them into our society, these essential workers, ensuring they're part of the social safety net, and including unemployment insurance, hazard pay, health care, and other opportunities for them to be able to not only prepare for a disaster, but also to equitably recover from a disaster. And finally, I want to leave with this sort of historical note of these climate-induced disasters. Obviously, as I mentioned before, it's not just limited to wildfires in California, but or wildfires in general that are happening in isolation. For example, the 2020 wildfires happened during a drought, also during a heat wave, and a COVID-19 pandemic. So all these environmental and pandemics were happening all at once, disproportionately impacting these communities. And farm workers, particularly undocumented Latino Indigenous migrants, were at the front line of these climate-induced disasters, from displacement of homes and housing and work to health impacts and loss of jobs. But looking at a historical perspective, farm workers have always been at the front lines of inequitable disaster impacts. If we look at the left-hand side of the Los Angeles Times, on March 12, 1928, the St. Francis Dam disaster is considered the second largest, most deadly disaster to this day in California's history. The first is the San Francisco earthquake and fire. The second is the St. Francis Dam. St. Francis Dam was built to retain water during a drought for Los Angeles, up in the most northern part of Los Angeles County. And it was done by Mulholland. If you ever read about urban planning, he was a self-taught engineer, very similar to on the East Coast, Robert Moses, and really getting through infrastructure projects, regardless of the social costs, particularly to low-income minority communities. Well, he built that dam really quickly on very inappropriate soil conditions. And eventually that dam broke on March 12, 1928, and set billions of gallons of water down the Santa Clara River from Los Angeles County to Ventura County, which is largely an agricultural region. And it wiped out homes, businesses, and agricultural fields. And thousands, hundreds were dead. And many of them were Mexican farm workers. And many of them to this day are put in mass graves and unidentified. But at the same time, during the recovery process, the county and including the American Red Cross did not want to provide services to the Mexican farm workers that were victims of disaster, and they had segregated areas. And so that just really shows the historic nature of the inequitable disaster impacts. And the eerie issue about this, 95 years to the day, another climate-induced disaster from an extreme storm impacted another agricultural farm worker, largely undocumented community in the central coast of California in the community of Bacaro. It was a levee. And it was 95 days, March 12th, 95 years to the day that the St. Francis Dam happened. And the Bacaro disaster is not natural. It happened because of extreme storms, yes, that overflowed a levee. But for decades, they knew that levee that was protecting farm worker communities was very vulnerable. But for decades, local government, including state officials and the Army Corps engineer, did not provide any resources for these communities or the adequate reimbursement for the damages that happened in other storms, because this was largely low-income housing and farm workers and farm worker individuals. So again, just really showing the historical nature of these disasters, that the farm workers and undocumented migrants are often at the front lines and the most disproportionately impacted from disasters. And it's not by accident or coincidence, but because of political choices that are prioritizing some lives or other, and diverting valuable resources to other communities, but largely not farm worker communities. So to end, I know I only have about 3 or 4 more minutes. In our research, we provide more prescriptive policy recommendations that have been implemented, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that in the Q&A. But in general, a very high-level view, we seek to legitimize migrant, indigenous community knowledge and lived experience in disaster planning, embrace migrant communities in disaster response and recovery, and largely before the next disaster happens, build those strong relationships, and bolster Latinx, indigenous civil society organizations' capacity in disaster relief and planning efforts. Again, just like the St. Francis Dam in 1928, when the American Red Cross, mainstream mutual aid organizations did not want to provide farm workers and undocumented migrants with disaster relief, migrant organizations, Latino organizations from other parts of the state came in to fill that gap. And that continues today. Largely mainstream organizations, federal for sure, and some state and local areas do not provide this relief services or preparedness services. So Latino and Indigenous organizations are often filling those gaps. So also highlight some other research that I'm doing on social vulnerability and marginalized or stigmatized populations. This is focused on LGBTQ communities. And this research really explores how and why LGBTQ communities are affected legally, psychologically, physically, and even theologically during disasters. And we really focus on moving away from this idea of the myth of gay affluence, where we often think of LGBTQ people to be male, white, and very wealthy, and therefore not disproportionately impacted. But our research and others' research has really shown that LGBTQ people, almost 40% or a little over 40% now, identify as people of color and have some of the highest rates of low-income individuals, and homelessness. And so we really focus on LGBTQ people of color and had some success working with FEMA to identify this. And while this has been successful in the work that we've done, both for LGBTQ populations and migrant communities, there also has been drawbacks in terms of the political climate that we're in right now. Many of you may have seen leading up to this election, where migrant communities as well as LGBTQ communities were scapegoated a lot, and saying that undocumented migrants and LGBTQ populations were getting prioritized when the fact they weren't, and really creating these scare tactics of creating programs to safeguard some of the most marginalized and stigmatized populations. And we specifically saw that in North Carolina, where many of these migrant communities were not receiving any aid, and but there was misinformation saying that FEMA was actually giving them aid, but by federal law, they're explicitly prohibited by providing any financial assistance to non-citizens or legal residents. At the same time, one of the webinars I did with FEMA, and you see my picture down at the corner there, where we were focusing on LGBTQ communities, in particular people of color. Elon Musk retweeted a tweet saying that FEMA didn't care about the rest of society, particularly in places like North Carolina, and they were focusing on LGBTQ people instead of the general population. So it's an uphill battle, and working with on these topics of social vulnerability, particularly for two groups that are highly marginalized and highly stigmatized in society. But I continue to have hope and work with some of the community-based organizations to ensure that they're not rendered invisible, forgotten, or have these continued disparate impacts going forward. So happy to talk more in the Q&A, and thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you so much for that, Michael. A little virtual round of applause. I feel like, right, like as you've kind of spoken about, that this is not only timely now, but it's been an issue that has definitely been affected by a lot of our communities. And I feel like you can kind of see through our chat and then also through our Q&A, like this is something that resonates with a lot of the folks who are in our communities and who are in the spaces now. And so with the remaining time, we're now going to invite our student panelists to share questions and thoughts on your presentation. Everyone else who is joining us, and I have been keeping an eye on the chat, so I do know that there's already a few questions from our other participants as well. But as our student panelists are asking their questions, please feel free to add any additional thoughts or questions you may want to share with our presenter via the chat or the Q&A feature, and then I'll get to those questions after our student panelists. And so I'm actually going to call on our student panelists, and we're actually going to begin with Alicia. If you feel ready.
Alicia.
If not, I could pass it to someone else.
I can go.
Perfect. Let's go with Julia.
Hi. So, thank you for your presentation. Very insightful. I am from Brazil, and I don't know if you've heard of, but in September, São Paulo is like the largest city in Brazil, and it had registered for 3 days in a row the worst air quality in the world because of the smoke in the Amazon and other parts of Brazil that are happening right now. So this is like a transnational issue. I see like it's happening in the whole world. And what worries me about it is how can we think of solutions, like transnational solutions, because there are like, I think there are like people fighting against in the world, in the whole world. So I don't know, how can we engage in like a transnational level about like thinking about bringing consciousness to people, or like just trying to break some stereotypes that kind of prevent people of being interested in the topic, or I don't know. Yeah, something related to that. I know it's very hard to think about solutions, and we've been seeing like this wave of extreme right-wing politicians being elected in the whole world also. So how can we think about like a future? And I know like this is happening in the US, this is happening in other places, and I don't know, I just wanted to know like from you, like a person that is researching this for is specialized in this. So if you have any hope to share with us.
Yeah, I think, in terms of climate change or also sort of social justice issues, it is dark times for many people here in the United States, and then and many countries around the world. As you say, these anti-climate populist kind of point of views that pit jobs, economic growth against the environment. So we see that all over the world. Unfortunately, we even see, I know this is a Latino themed colloquium. We even see that within our local communities. And I know it brings a lot of people down, but I have engaged in this work for many years now, and I do it because I am a hopeful person. And I try to stay hopeful, and I think that's why partly I became a professor. Is you all also make me hopeful for the next generation to continue the fight alongside, a multi-generational approach. And I really, I think having those hard discussions at the local level. There's a common saying in the United States by Tip O'Neill, who I believe was a House Speaker in the U.S. All politics are local, and really understanding that local climate action is a local issue. If you really want to tackle climate action, is working in your local communities and showing the different public health or economic frames and benefits of climate change. As I started off this presentation, is all communities, not just Latino communities, are experiencing the high cost of inflation. Paying for utilities bill, paying 100 and something each time they go to the grocery store to feed their family, and making climate change real and showing the benefits, not just the costs. That's one way, and in a political sense as well, is engaging with your local elected officials, from your city council members to your school board members, and really asking them what is their take on climate change, because these individuals at the local level eventually want higher positions, and letting their constituency know at a very early part of their political careers that their climate change is important. And I think having that voice and always engaging, not just on the big presidential issues, but also on the local level, because again, these people move up this political chain. And those are a couple of things. Getting involved with your community-based organizations. I know Professor Cabrera has you working with some great environmental justice groups in Chicago. That's one avenue to get involved at the local level and stay hopeful, because those organizations largely are at the front lines of these climate impacts, and are quite agile and try to make their communities more resilient and thrive going forward.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to call on Gina.
Hi. I really enjoyed your presentation. It was very eye-opening. As a person who's visited California many times and have family there, there's a lot of that I really did not know about. So with my question is, within your research and even like California laws, has there been any talk of policies or community initiatives that could better support these Latino and Indigenous communities? And with the political climate right now, how do you think this would be affected by like the recent elections?
Yeah, I think it makes us work harder, I showed that the screenshots of Elon Musk in the tweet, that's quite scary. Like I wake up and get some texts and think, oh, you need to check Twitter. Your face is on there, and there's those Twitter views got, I believe, 40 million views. And the video just kept on circulating. Look, they didn't target me; they targeted the FEMA government staff. So that just shows how, like, going forward, these equitable initiatives are going to be targeted. The entire dismantling of the US EPA's environmental justice programs over the last 4 years are on the chopping block again. So having that local focus is quite important. That states and county and local focus is going to be even more important than 2016 when Trump first got into office. So I think it's staying connected. I advise with the California Undocu Fund, which is a statewide network of these migrant serving organizations that have taken on disaster work. They're not disaster organizations. They're immigrant rights organizations, they're health organizations. Some of them are education organizations that work with migrant communities, but they sort of subsumed this additional responsibility because government at all levels has not taken up that responsibility. So through that network, we have been pushing for hazard pay and seen some success on a very ad hoc basis with individual growers, winemakers. I know a state senator that I'm working with is currently working on some legislation, which reminds me I have to email them back, on hazard pay during disasters and looking at how that would work. Last year, that same senator was able to get some additional labor protections, and particularly being able to use sick pay if the air quality conditions are quite unhealthy. Then people were allowed legally to use sick pay, not to work during those climate disaster environments. And over the last couple of years, at a ad hoc basis, we've been able to funnel millions of dollars to undocumented migrants to pay for lost wages, lost belongings, childcare, on healthcare, and all these sort of impacts that are happening through these various types of disasters.
Thank you so much for that. Now I'm going to pass it over to Vanessa.
Hi, I know everyone's told you this, but thank you for your presentation. I really like the firsthand accounts that you gave. That was really jarring, and it really brought to life how serious this topic is. My question is, within your research, have you seen any community-led efforts or specific grassroots efforts that have addressed these issues within these communities?
Yeah, as I mentioned before, the California Undocu Fund, which is a statewide network, is made up of individual organizations, but within that, the two steering committee members are the Undocu Fund and the 805 Undocu Fund. And they have created these sort of philanthropic and mutual aid services to provide to undocumented migrants during disaster. That has been a model for other areas, like North Carolina is starting to, and other East Coast regions are starting to create these private philanthropic organizations that are essentially supplementing the work of government and mutual aid organizations such as the American Red Cross, the Salvation Army, that does not have inroads to some of these communities. They also have created some changes in legislation where there's more guidance for local governments and their disaster plans to reach out to migrant communities, farm worker communities, and build those relationships and that are both culturally and linguistically appropriate. And another one would be language justice issues, making sure that evacuation information is decimated in commonly spoken languages in the area.
Thank you for that. Now I'm going to pass it over to Melissa.
Thank you for your presentation. It really hits home. My parents were farm workers, so it really hits home. So are there any educational workshops or services for undocumented farm workers about their rights, like for example, their healthcare rights, and them knowing what are they legally, or any services that could be provided for them?
Yeah, so two examples, both from an advocacy standpoint, organizations like North Bay Jobs with Justice, which I work with, and another organization, the Mixteco Indigenous Community Organizing Project, MICUP, do that sort of workers' rights and civil rights education and translation work. Also, those organizations have done an innovation in Ventura County, which had created some pilot programs to create farm worker resource centers. So the county has a dedicated office to work with farm workers on health issues, workers' rights. Well, not so much worker rights, but definitely like healthcare, education, immigration workshops, and other types of services that this community will need, including disaster communications. So that's an innovation that came out of these 2017 wildfires in Ventura County, is a sort of the organization of multiple nonprofits serving migrant farm workers, and to advocate at the Board of Supervisors to create this office and have more language justice initiatives.
Thank you so much for that. Alicia, am I able to pass it back to you as our final student Q&A?
Sure. I'm sorry if I didn't respond earlier. So thank you for the presentation. A question I had was, I know that you always refer to them as invisibilized communities. And I remember during the pandemic, there was a moment where they became more visibilized, but as essential workers, and people were paying attention to people who were working in agriculture, but in a way as they had to keep working in order to keep society fed and surviving. And I'm wondering if you know of any cultural work that's going on to try and reframe or go from essential worker to these are people who should be socially integrated and have these protections.
Yeah, so I think that's the work that these organizations have done to humanize them and not make it just faceless ideas of undocumented migrants that should be deported, or are that term I used earlier, considered worthy disaster victims. You know, obviously, victim is like a very disempowering terminology or word to be called a victim. But in some of these cases, they're not even allowed to be called a victim. They're not even considered a victim because they're undocumented. So it's sort of like by emphasizing worthy disaster victims, is just highlighting sort of the multiple forms of invisibility and disposability that this population is encountering. But definitely through these advocacy campaigns that these organizations are doing, demanding workers' rights during wildfires or other types of disasters, to hazard pay, to unemployment insurance. There's been movement at the state level, which has been vetoed once, to create a fund to provide unemployment insurance for some of these undocumented migrants. So even in places like California, it's an uphill battle. And I think the next couple of years will be quite difficult, but we'll see how things turn out. You know, in the news today, though, and it's of course it's Los Angeles, but Los Angeles just voted unanimously at the city council level, and the mayor will sign to make the city a sanctuary city.
Thank you so much for that. And so we are in our last like 5 minutes of the webinar. We're gonna for sure get to one question from the audience, or maybe two, depending on how long your response is. And so the first question that we have from the audience comes from Rosa, who's our director, and she asks, have you been in touch with some of the farm workers that you know, and how are they coping with the very possible harmful actions promised by the new administration? And a few questions are actually about, right, sort of like us entering this new administration. And a part two to that question is, what influence do you think that farmers and companies that employ undocumented farm workers have to protect them from deportation?
I wish that's a good question. I wish I knew the answer. You know, we've seen the succession of these anti-immigrant bills from Florida to Texas, and it does have an impact of migrants moving around, uprooting their lives, and having a negative impact on the food supply chain. To the extent that this current the future administration, the Trump administration, does it, I do not know. And it's sort of it's a day-by-day thing. You hear something new every day. We just saw the news earlier this week that he said he was targeting Chinese nationals first. So I don't know what that means. Is he going to create a racial hierarchy and a racial ethnic based on national origin hierarchy of who he deports? I don't know. I think we're living in the world of uncertainty right now. But the migrant farm workers, I was just on a webinar on some other research project that we're doing, and you know, there's hope. And of course, people are always scared. They live in constant fear of deportation in their everyday lives already. But this is going to be magnified. But hopefully, you know, you've probably seen the news that I've seen is that some migrants, even those that have former undocumented migrants that are now U.S. citizens, that also have undocumented migrants as their family, you've seen them on the news that they're hoping that, you know, since they're not criminals themselves, they're not going to be targeted. So I think people are just scared more than normal, but they're continuing with the work that they do because they have to, they're here, and they're a vital part of our society and need to succeed for their families.
Thank you for that. And to in an attempt to try to leave us on a positive note in our last 2 minutes, what do you think what are the things that we can do within our own local communities to help protect Native, Indigenous, and undocumented folks, whether we live in California or whether we're based in Chicago? What is something you could kind of offer?
Yeah, so that local action that I mentioned before, your professor has you working with some of those community-based organizations, which have a lot of migrant communities in them, and uplifting the need for protection of these migrant communities, and always having that sort of intersectional approach to environmental justice, that it's not just a community that's disproportionately impacted, but the impacts are disparate based on people's status in society or identity in society, your gender, your race, and then of course your immigration status. So I just keeping that in mind with the community organizations that you work with, uplifting the need to protect these communities, particularly in these times. So, you know, I think that will give you a lot of hope working with these organizations, that you feel that, at least for me, I feel like I'm part of something larger, or collective, and I'm not alone, and I'm not just one person, but I'm working in a collective of organizations and groups that want to improve the situation. So that's where I found a lot of hope and inspiration, is working on these projects with others, and not just in where I live or near where I live, but throughout the state, and throughout the country as well.
Thank you so much for that. So yeah, thanks for kind of leaving us off on a sort of positive note. Thank you for everyone who attended this really great webinar. This is actually our last of our Climates of Inequality series for the semester. So thank you to everyone who attended all three, or maybe this is the first one you attended, which is also great. In the chat, I've also dropped the links to our upcoming public programs and then also to our social media. We hope that you stay connected. And if you would like to rewatch this video or share it with anyone, you can view this recording within the next few days on our website and also on our YouTube channel. And you'll also be able to find the previous recordings from our 2 previous Climates of Inequality. So yeah, and so like with that, we're exactly at 6 p.m. And so a little virtual round of applause again for Michael, and thank you so much for sharing your presentation with us.
Thank you, and have a good night.